Well, once again, folks, we are joined by the man who's been called the Johnny Cash of storytelling, the Tennessee stud, Ron Fuller, for another edition of Storytime with the Tennessee Stud, where he regales us with tales about his family's 90-plus year experience in professional wrestling. It's the kind of stories that you can only hear on a regular basis, either here or on his own podcast, The Studcast, available on the Arcadian Vanguard Network. And Brian Last, I'm sure in the course of our program here today, will have told you 16 times how to listen to that program. But in the meantime, we want to welcome him, ladies and gentlemen, Ron Fuller, the Tennessee Stud. Ron, thanks for being back.
Oh, thank you very much, Jim. It's always a pleasure to be with you, man. It's a pleasure to be on the phone. Pleasure to hear your voice. And well,
it's a pleasure to be heard these days.
All of us are happy to be heard, right?
Yes.
We're still above ground, thank goodness.
There you go. And we've talked so much of every time we've had you on the show, and of course, like I said, on your program, your show is basically stories from the dozens of relatives that you have had in professional wrestling, and yourself wrestled and promoted at a high level, etc. But it all began really with your grandparents, your grandfather, and his brothers, the original Welch brothers. And Roy Welch was kind of the patriarch of Southern wrestling. And there's just so many fantastic stories involving him. And I know you had a couple, at least, that you wanted to share. One, at least, that you want to share with us today. But he's kind of where it all got started.
Yes, sir. He is where it all got started, and he was the very first in the family. Born in 1902 in Sallisaw, Oklahoma. Out west most of his life, his early life. Grew up poor. A lot of Indian blood in him. And they just had a really rough time, and they struggled as a lot of people did back in those days. I'm sure we're talking about the early 1900s, and for some reason, he's a wild son of a gun. He decided he's going to do something that very few people at that day and time ever got involved in, and that was to become a wrestler and a professional wrestler at that. So, what I would like to do, Jim, is basically kind of back up and start Roy from his infancy when he was small, and give your listeners an opportunity to hear about one of the pioneers of the sport and how he developed and where he came from and what possessed him to be the type of person that he ended up being. And I'm going to start. I'll just give you a bunch of little small stories, pieces of stories today. One of the first stories that Roy told me that really shocked me was he was about 9 years old. He was the oldest brother, and Lester had not been born. He had three brothers. Two of them were close to his age. One was about 2 years younger than him, and the other was about 3 years younger. So, but after him was Jack.
That was Herb and Jack, right?
Herb and Jack, and they were just slightly younger than what Roy was. And Roy is 9 years old. They live in New Mexico, on the high plains of New Mexico, in the northern part of the state. And in the wintertime, it got really cold there. They didn't have much stuff. They had a very old house, I guess, they lived in. He didn't remember much about it himself, but he said it was pretty sorry. It had holes in the walls, and they froze at night. And they had a few cows. Now, my great-grandfather, named Ed, he was a tough old son of a gun, and the word was he was a rustler, and somehow he had a few cows, and probably because he didn't have any money, he might have stole those cows. There's a good chance of it, right? So we come from some bad background in a way. So what happens is they live in the northern New Mexico prairie, and Roy, the snow comes every winter. The snow and the cold weather comes, and what they needed to do is they had no hay to feed their cows, so they would drive their cows 200 or 300 miles south off of the plateau in the northern part of New Mexico into southern New Mexico. And so they'd never done this before. And Roy tells me the story, and he says, Ed says, you guys, tomorrow we're going to we're going to take the cows south. And he said he really didn't explain anything to us. We didn't know what he was talking about. So he says the next morning they woke up, and obviously they had 5 or 6 or 8 cows, whatever it was. And they started, he said, we had no shoes, so we're barefooted. They're really poor boys. And he said he had the only horse. We didn't have horses to ride. He rode the horse, and we walked on our bare feet for 200 miles to push these cows off the plateau in the southern part of New Mexico. So he says that they start on the journey, and he says about the 3rd day in that a tarantula, they're walking down a path, and there's a tarantula in the path, and he sees it. He jumps off the path to the left. Jack's behind him, and Jack sees it. He jumps off the path to the right, and Herb is the 3rd one in line. Now, Herb's about 6 years old, and he comes upon the tarantula, and Roy said, we're screaming, look out, that's a tarantula. And he said Herb raised up his foot and slammed his heel down on the top of the tarantula and smashed him in the ground, ground him with his heel. And they're like, oh, look out. And he goes, and then he smashed him in the heel, and the blood comes running out of the spider. And he says, that's just a spider. And he walks on down the path. So these are rugged boys. These guys are young kids, but they're pretty rugged. So they finished this little herding trip, and they accomplished that, get them off the plateau. They get them about 200 miles south. And Roy and Ed tells Roy, he says, come here, I want to show you how to do something. And he had a thing of barbed wire, and he wrapped the wire in a little long, maybe a foot long thing, and he made a little crank on the top part of it. And he says, I'm going to show you how to wire rabbits out of a hole. So Roy's like, heck yeah, show me how to do that. So he takes him over, and they find a rabbit hole, and he puts that barbed wire in there, and he swirls it around and it sticks into the hair of the rabbit, and he pulls the rabbit out of the hole, and they eat the rabbit. So Roy's like, well, that's pretty cool. And he says, you're going to need that. And he goes, well, what do you mean I'm going to need that? And he says, I'll tell you tomorrow morning. So the next morning he gets up, and he says, okay, we're going back home. And Roy's like, everybody's packing up their gear, and they got their little old blankets they've been sleeping on, and they all get ready. And he says, but you ain't going, Roy. Now, Roy's 9 years old. Now, they're in the middle of nowhere. There are nothing. There's no homes. There's no neighborhoods. There's no highways. We're talking about 1910, maybe, in the middle of a prairie and somewhere in the southern part of New Mexico. And he says, you're staying, Roy. And then Roy goes, what do you mean, Dad? And he goes, well, I've taught you how to feed yourself. You know how to build a fire. And now you know how to get a rabbit out of the hole. And you're going to stay and follow these cows for 3 months. And the end of 3 months, this is pretty heavy, Jim. He says, at the end of 3 months, we're going to come and find you. And
Jesus Christ, this is a heavy winter plan here.
Yes. Now, you bear in mind on the northern part of the state, you got the high plateaus, and those temperatures are a lot colder. Southern part of the state, down toward Mexico, you got warmer temperatures. So he's not dealing with this horrible temperature, but he's dealing as a 9-year-old with feeding himself and following cows for 3 months. He's and Roy says, well, how do I get them to go anywhere? He said, you don't get them to go anywhere. You just get up when they get up and they start moving, you follow them. And 3 months from now, we're going to come back and find you. So 3 months later, sure enough, they come back. I don't know how long it takes them to find him. And he says at 9 years old, he says, I was real happy to see him. I can tell you that, so.
Good Lord.
Gives you an idea of how those boys were raised. And they turned out to be really, really tough and rugged guys. They just, they were a breed upon themselves. So once he gets older, he decides that he wants to become a wrestler, and he first hooks up with with the gentleman out of Amarillo that has the homes. He's a really big name.
Good Lord, Brian, help me.
Cal Farley.
Cal Farley.
Cal Farley. Geez, guys, thank you very much. Cal Farley. He meets Cal Farley. He wants to go. Cal Farley is a wrestler who wrestled in the wartime, and now he comes home, and he's out of Kansas. He comes into Oklahoma and into Texas, and they're in that general area. Now Roy's moved from New Mexico into Texas, into the oil area of Texas, like the oil fields of Texas, around Borger, Texas. And he sees an advertised wrestling deal in Amarillo. He goes there. For some reason, he wants to meet Cal Farley, and he does meet Cal Farley. Cal Farley takes a liking to him, and he works out with him a few times, and he sends him on to the original Dutch Mantell. Now, we're not talking about the Dutch Mantell that we all know, Jim. We're
right, who was named after the original guy who was a West Texas shooter.
There you go. Dutch Mantell. Cal Farley's a shooter. Cal Farley's a great shooter. And just to relay more history here, Cal Farley becomes a national hero because he starts these boys' ranches and boys' homes. And they make, in 1950s, they make a stamp for Cal Farley. Cal Farley is such a humanitarian that he becomes a hero out west in that area. And boys, let's just take Eddie Graham as an example, gets involved in Florida many, many years later in the 60s and the 50s and the 60s with the boys' ranch in Florida because of Cal Farley, who was 60 or 70 years earlier. So Cal Farley has a great effect on Roy. He turns Roy over to Dutch Mantell, the old shooter. Dutch Mantell is a character among wrestling history and I don't know, a lot of people know what I know because Roy told me a lot of these stories. I traveled with him a lot of times when I was 6, 8, 10 years old, and he would tell me these stories. So when he got into telling me about Dutch Mantell, I was like, wow, tell me about him. What did he do, right? He says Dutch Mantell was a wealthy guy, that Dutch had a way of making money that was totally different than anybody else probably out west. And what he would do is he wasn't a really big guy, but he really was a tremendous wrestler, and he had great technique, and he knew the leverage, and he knew the necessary things to be a great shooter. And so he worked for many years and wrestled as much as he could. And then he came upon this idea that made him rich. And I asked Roy, what was that idea? He said, what he would do is he'd go to these little western towns, and he would show up at the saloons about 5, 6 o'clock when the guys were getting through with their herding or whatever they did, and they would all come in to have a shot or two. And he would go to these bars, arrive in the town, nobody knew who he was, and he would go in and start making a lot of noise. And he'd be like, hey, I'm here, I'm old, Dutch Mantell, and I'm the fastest runner anybody's ever seen. I'm here, I want to bet you guys that there's nobody in this town that can run as fast as I do. And, the bets would be small. Everybody, we don't know this guy, and he ain't big. Maybe he's fast. They'd all talk to each other around, the guys in the saloon, and they would go, oh, okay. And he'd cover the bets. The bets would be small. So once he got the bets covered, they would just go right out in front of the saloon. They'd run down the street. They'd get somebody to go down there about 100 yards, and here's the starting point. And somebody say go, and the two guys would race, him and the guy would beat him. And he would go back into the saloon. He'd be pissed. Hi, dang, man, I can't believe I lost the race. He goes, well, I may not be the fastest guy, but I'm strong. I can arm wrestle anybody here. I am the strongest guy. now, that's starting to, now the guys are looking at him, and, he's certainly not fast, and he's not big. He don't look strong. So, they're willing now to invest a little more, so the bets go up, and now they're betting a little bit more. And some of them run out of the saloon down the street to their buddies. Hey, you need to come down here because there's a dumbass, and he's going to look, he's covering all these bets, right? So now it gets to be the saloon starts to fill up, and then the bets go up, and he covers all the bets, and then they sit down there at the table, and the biggest, strongest guy, and they all, naturally all the guys go, let's get old Joe over there. He's really strong, They find the strongest guy, and they sit down there at the table, and they have the arm wrestling contest. Somebody says go, and wham, they just slam his arm down like he's about to break his arm, man. Like he's a weak, wimpy little son of a gun, right? Nobody. So, now he gets really upset. Oh, Darby's screaming, this is ridiculous. Oh, it never happened to me before. And I'm not through. And I've got more money, right? He's screaming, I've got more money. I'm going to cover the bets. He goes, and in fact, what I'll do is I'm a wrestler. I can wrestle. Now they're all looking at each other like, well, this guy is just full of shit. I mean, he can't run. He ain't strong. Now, how's he going to be a good wrestler, right? So now they all leave the bar. He says, I'll cover all the bets. In fact, I will double the bet. If you bet $1, I'll give you $2 if you win. He said the bar would empty out. And then about 30 minutes, they would come from everywhere. He had every man in town in the bar now, right? They're standing out on the sidewalk. And he's saying, I'm going to double the bets. And here comes the money. I mean, they're all just throwing money at him. And he's covering it. Got your bet. And then they go out. They say, well, we're going to wrestle. We're right out there in the street. So they go back out in the street like the time they were going to run, and he and the guy starts wrestling. And he just takes the guy down, man, hooks him right away. The guy screams like hell, man. I give. And he gets up and cleans the town out.
Oh, my God. And, that is the perfect we've talked on the show before about the true definition of marks, and how marks can be in the stands or in the locker room. These days in the business, they can be on both sides of the fence. But the true definition of a mark is at root is a guy who thought that he was making a sucker out of somebody else, but it turns out that guy was making a sucker out of him. The mark always thinks that he's fucking somebody else, and he's getting fucked.
It's really a phenomenal. When I heard it, I was like, wow, man, is that brilliant or what? And I said, well, how did he do it from there? And he said, listen, son, it was 1900. It was and he said there was no highways and there was no cars out west, and the only thing they had was telegraph, and they ain't going to telegraph that, hey, this guy just took us for a lot. He said they'd go 20 miles away, he'd ride his horse 20, 30 miles away to the next town, he'd do it there the next day. And the next day he'd do it at another. And he said he got so much money, he bought a car. He said toward the end of his training with Dutch bought a car. And Dutch was involved he had been wrestling with some guys out of Houston. And Houston was one of the few cities big enough in Texas to have some type of professional events. And Dutch had worked in some of those events in the past. So a war takes place about this time. Now, Roy has worked out with Dutch a few times. The first time he works out with Dutch breaks his ribs puts a crooked leg scissor on him and breaks his ribs on purpose because he doesn't want to train him. And Roy gets well in 3 months. He goes back, and Dutch says, I see you here again, man. What do you want, boy? And he says, I want to learn. And he goes, I already hurt you. You don't need you can't learn. So he gives him another chance. He breaks his wrist the second time.
Oh.
He just doesn't want to train him. And that's the way, guys do it nowadays. That's what happened to Hulk Hogan in Tampa. They didn't want to train him, and they broke his leg. So it was that type of scenario where he broke his ribs, he broke his wrist. Finally, Roy goes back again, and Dutch says to him, I think you're going to be a wrestler, boy. So he takes him under his wing. So Dutch gets a call or a telegram, or somehow someone contacts him from Houston. 2 promoters have set up, first probably opposition in the history of professional wrestling, maybe. 2 promoters are running Houston. And obviously, when that happens, it's not good for business. So the 2 promoters have these events for a period of time, and they finally realize that, this ain't going to work. We're neither one going to make it. So the 2 promoters sit down and they say, here's what we need to do. You find your best shooter, and I'll find my best shooter, and whoever wins the shoot, we'll advertise the shoot. We'll split the money on the shoot, and whoever wins it wins Houston. They are the promoter. So one of them contacts Dutch because he's a great shooter. I don't know who the other guy was, but Roy says that Dutch and him get in Dutch's car. And this is like now we're 1918, cars, Model T, an old Model T, no highways. He said there was no highways, and you had to drive around the barbed wire fences. When you came to a barbed wire fence, you just had to follow the fence to get around it. He said they drove from Amarillo to Houston in 1918 in the Model T. I said, how long did it take? He said, we slept at night in the prairie. He said it took 8 days to make it from Amarillo to Houston in a car.
Because that's all the way across the state of Texas. That's got to be 700 miles.
Oh, it's a long way, and if you go into Texas, there's a lot of long rides in Texas. Yeah. That's darn sure. So he goes to Texas. He gets there, and he tells Roy, he says, I only bring you, he got that Dutch accent, I'd only bring you to watch my back. He says, I don't know who's going to do what while I'm here. But he said, I'm going to take care of the guy in the ring, but you got to be there in my corner. So Roy follows him. They go to the shoot. He says it's a huge crowd. He doesn't, he says, that biggest thing I'd ever seen, And he says, the 2 of them got in the ring, Dutch and the guy. And he said that he expected Dutch to put a hook scissor on him or to do something, a wrestling move. And he said that the first time they got together, they locked up, and the guy pushed Dutch back into the rope. And Dutch put his head out of the rope, ducked underneath the rope, and they broke it up. He said the second time they pushed back into the rope, they locked up and pushed back into the rope. Dutch pushed the guy in the rope, and the guy took a swing at it. The guy took a swing rather than wrestling. And, that surprised me because you got to shoot, you don't expect them to try to box, right?
Right.
So he throws a punch at Dutch, and Dutch hits him. Roy said he hit him. He'd never seen a punch like it. He said he hit the guy on the side of his eye, and it broke the orbital bone below his eye, and his eyeball fell out of his face and hung on a little stem, right? Yeah. That's
what happens when your eye gets knocked out. From what I've read in medical journals, is it hangs by that little thing that it's hooked up to. Yeah. Oh my God.
And then what he said happened, and then he said, what happened now is he said the guy's got one eye looking at the floor and the other one looking straight out. And he says it screwed up his equilibrium so badly that he instantly started puking. He went down on his knees. He started puking in the ring. And they called them bang, bang, bang. They rung the bell. They rang Dutch's hand. Right? Dutch had beat him, right? He knocked his eye out, literally. So this is how things were back in the day, man. I mean, they talk about tough dudes. So they take this guy and they put a towel over his eye, and they put his eye back into the socket as best they can, and they take him to the dressing room. And Roy says, he's like wanting to congratulate Dutch. Geez, that was great, man. Gosh. And Dutch says, I want to see him. Take me to his dressing room. And so Roy goes, what are you going to just take me to his dressing room? He says. So Roy goes and takes him, instead of going to the dressing room that they came out of, he takes him to the dressing room where the guy is that's got his eye knocked out. And he says the Dutch walks in, and the guy is sitting there on a stool. They're about to take him to the hospital. And he's got the towel over his eye, and he looks up at Roy. He's got the towel over his eye, and Roy said that he jerks his head back like, "Oh gosh, you're right. What are you doing here, right?" And he goes, "What are you here for?" And Dutch says, he says, "It's a good thing you quit." He said, "I was already looking at that other eye."
Well, that's a form of an apology. Gosh, sorry I couldn't pull your other eye out. Oh my God!
So that's just, it was a heavy duty life back in those days. Being around and being trained by a guy like that. So Dutch trains him. Dutch finishes his training, most of his training, and then he says, "I want you to go with this fair, traveling circus or fair back then, like they were in the day way back."
Yeah.
And they had what was called the Valley, in which they brought out 2 or 3 wrestlers, and they had a stage, and they put those 2 wrestlers on the stage, and somebody took the megaphone and said, "Hey, come on over here. You want to see a wrestler? You want to wrestle a wrestler?" And they would draw a crowd over there, and then they would say, "Okay, who wants to wrestle so-and-so? Who would like to wrestle one of these guys?" And they get 2 or 3 guys out of the crowd, and they offer them amount of money, like $5. Huge amount of money in 1900, 1920, and they would get some takers, and they would come up on the stage, and then they would say, "Well, who do you want to wrestle?" Roy said on this particular fair he was wrestling on, there was 3 of them, and he was the smallest of the 3. And he said 95% of the time they wanted me, right? He said, because I was small. And so I said, "Well, how did you do in those matches?" And he kind of chuckled at me, and he said, "Well, I never lost." Obviously, nobody ever beat him.
And that was in those days, and that's the athletic shows at the carnivals, the at shows. That's why that wrestling has such a close tie to the carnivals and to Carney, the language that, until the rappers took it away, and now you can look it up on the internet. I remember one time Buddy Wayne's son Ken was at one of the fairs that we were running. He'd set the ring up, and he was walking his girlfriend around, and they were playing the shoot the water in the clown's mouth or whatever. And one of the guys behind the counter tells the other guy, says, "Yeah, look at this Fizzuck and Mizark," right? And Ken said, "Hey, I ain't no fucking Mark." It scared the guys. But the carnivals and wrestling, and it was such a similar world because so many carnivals had wrestling shows, and so many of those old timers that had to be able to shoot, and not only to shoot, but to shut guys down and hurt them if they had to keep from losing the money. Because how long would Roy lasted as a carnival wrestler if he was out there losing the carnival's money?
Oh, yeah. If he'd ever lost, I assume that's the end of his career. He's finished, right? So,
yeah.
Dutch gave him tremendous training, and Dutch, now he's knocking guys' eyes out, and he's looking at the other eye, he's got that mindset, he's got that killer mentality, and he puts that killer mentality in Roy at a young age. Roy's like 20 years old or 18 years old, 18 to 22, before Dutch finishes with him and says he's ready. But anyway, he had to win those matches because those fair people weren't going to give up that money. That's for darn sure. And he was just tough enough and bad enough and mean enough that's what he did. So he comes home from the Valley, and he goes back to Dutch again, and Dutch is now shooting with him on a regular basis and has trained him so much so that Dutch puts a hook scissor on him again, just like he broke his ribs for the very first time they shot together. And Roy turned in the hook scissor, which is extremely, extremely painful. broke his ribs again, but was able to turn and get on top of Dutch, and he actually pinned Dutch. And Dutch got up and said to him, I said, what did he do when you pinned him? And he said, well, my ribs were broken. He said, I really didn't get up too good. I was still bent over and I was selling, but he says, I never wrestle you again. He said he never would shoot with me again. He said, you ready? I must send you to pro. Okay, so
that was the 1920s Oklahoma Prairie equivalent of snatch the pebble from my hand, grasshopper. It's time for you to leave.
That's it.
Once he beat the guy, there you go. He's done. He's graduated.
There you go. He graduated. Now, I have one more quick story here to tell, because during the time he's doing this training with Dutch, he's working in the oil fields in Borger, Texas. Oil has just been discovered, and there are just hundreds of wells there. Roy said the towers were everywhere, and he had been there for 2 years training, and he went to work every day on the oil rigs. And he said that there was a bully in that oil camp that was a big guy, probably 6'3", and weighed 250 pounds, monstrous for that day and time. And he said the guy just humiliated everybody and made everybody miserable, hurt them and made fun of them. And he said all of those things. And he said he never did it to me. He said, I don't know whether he knew I was training or what the deal was, but he said he left me alone for 2 years. And Roy then Dutch gets him a job in Columbus, Ohio. He sends him to become a professional wrestler in Columbus, Ohio, through a connection he has. And this is Roy's last day in the oil field. And he says, the bully, my last day there, as I'm leaving, getting ready to leave, he says, the bully comes to me and says, it's your day. Now I hear you've been trying to be a wrestler. No, he says the bully starts on him. And he said, everybody knew something about him, and they knew he was tough. Roy was. And they wanted to see this bully's ass whipped really, really badly. So Roy says, okay, let's just see what you got. So that's all it took. He said the oil rigs, they just started coming from every rig. They was like, come on. He said they made a huge circle, around the oil, between two rigs. And he said they were probably 50 deep, and there between, and then the two of them got in the circle. And so now this tells you something about what Roy's mentality is a little different than Dutch's in a way. So they start shooting, Roy and this big, huge guy. Roy said he took him down. He put him in an Oklahoma ride. An Oklahoma ride is a grapevine. He grapevined his right leg. The guy's on his hands and knees. He stretches across his body diagonally. He takes his left arm, and now he has control of the guy. Okay, the guy's big. He said he knew he wanted to get control of him and blow him up. So the guy started straining and straining. He couldn't get out of the Oklahoma ride. Now, you can't hurt anybody with an Oklahoma ride, but you can sure contain somebody and control somebody.
It's a wrestling equivalent of the rope-a-dope. He's going to blow himself up trying to get out.
There you go. So he takes that tact. He says he gets his mindset, I'm going to get my Oklahoma ride, I'm going to blow him up, and then I'm going to humiliate him. So what he does is he puts that on him. He said 2 or 3 times. The big guy got up. Roy stretched across his back and would jump backwards and land on top of him. And the dust would fly. The whole crowd of guys, they're like, oh, gosh. And he would hold on. Guy would finally roll over on his stomach again. Roy's back in the same position. He's got him. He blows him up. And when he blows him up, he reaches down. He takes that Oklahoma ride. Now he reaches that arm that he's holding. He reaches under that arm and goes behind the guy's neck and gets what's more like a abdominal stretch. Now he's got a real killer finish hold, okay? But he doesn't take advantage of the abdominal stretch. My granddad was an unreal dude. Instead, he puts him in a position now where he can hurt him. He's got him there. He reaches down and he unzips his pants. Okay. Now there's 150, 200 oil rig workers watching this, and he unzips his pants. And they're all good. He says it all went quiet. It's like, what in the hell is he doing? And he said he reaches in there and he pulls out his penis, right? And he goes, now he's got him. He's holding him there. The guy's blown up and everything else. Now he's really kicking and fighting. He's embarrassed as hell. And Roy goes, well, I'll be damned, real loud so everybody can hear. He goes, no wonder this son of a bitch is such an ass. He goes, look at this baby little penis he's got.
Oh my God.
I mean,
that sounds like something Ronnie Garvin would have done to the job guys on TBS on some Saturday morning almost.
And what he did, he took the opportunity, he turned an opportunity to really hurt a guy that they all wanted to see hurt. He hurt him in a way that was so magnificent. When I heard the story, I was like, geez, it's ingenious. It's just fabulous, fantastic. And he said he then turned him loose. He said the guy laid there on the ground. He's blown up. He's got his prick hanging out of his pants. And and the whole group, he said the damn guys were he said he'd never heard a roar. They were just all of them pounding each other's backs. He said they parted like the Red Sea for me to walk between them and left. He said they all backed off and they were slapping my back and going, Roy, that was unbelievable. That was absolutely fantastic. And he said he never looked back. That was his last little oil field trip. And, that's a little bit of what my granddad was all about.
Oh, my God. And the guy was lucky he didn't have Dutch Mantell get a hold of him and he pulled his eye out instead of his penis.
That's it. That's kind of it. I mean, he took a different tack. And, after hearing it, I thought it was a pretty ingenious way of doing things. And, I may stop it here today, Jim, because I really want to talk, another time, next time I tell some stories, I'd kind of like to tell a little more Roy's story, so that people can get an idea of what I do kind of basically on my Studcast. And,
well, you are most assuredly invited back to talk more about Roy, and everybody can listen on the Arcadian Vanguard Network to the Studcast every week, wherever they get their favorite podcast, as my lovely co-host, Hawaiian Brian says, wherever you steal your internet, you can steal it and hear all kinds of stories like this. And from everybody else in your family has been involved in pro wrestling over the last 90 years. So we will definitely have you back, Ron.
Well, thank you very much. And I really appreciate the opportunity to, I love to tell my stories and I really love to tell my stories about my family because my family is like no family in the history of the business. The old timers are all shooters and I know a little bit of that myself. It's a great opportunity for me, and I just love being a part of it. And thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to tell my stories on sometime on your program. And next time, maybe back next time if you'd like me to, I will give them a few more Roy stories.
We hope you've enjoyed this stud story. Find the Ron Fuller Studcast at tnstud.com, iTunes, Stitcher, Podcast Addict, and everywhere you find your favorite podcast. Now, back to the great Brian Last and the Experience himself, Jim Cornette.